Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it's time for another discography ranking. And today we are going to be ranking the studio albums of one Mr. Bob Dylan. Okay, there's no easy way to summarize Bob Dylan's life in just a few minutes, but I'm going to do my best here, so bear with me. Robert Allen Zimmerman, born the 24th of May, 1941 in Duluth, Minnesota. Raised in the town of Hibbing, Dylan got his musical education through the rock and roll boom of the mid-1950s and began his own performing career in various clubs while attending the University of Minnesota, which, by the way, I went to the University of Minnesota myself. If you haven't been to the Dinkytown area of campus, highly recommend Tony's Diner, great food, and sits right across the street from Dylan's old apartment. So check it out if you're in the area. But Dylan only attended the university for 1 year. He dropped out and moved to New York City in 1961, where he got enough attention playing local clubs in the Greenwich Village area that he got studio work, first as a session harmonica player for Carolyn Hester, and then as a solo act signed to Columbia Records. Dylan's first record was not especially successful, but it was his second effort, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, that sparked what would become a meteoric rise in popularity, with songs like Blowin' in the Wind, catching the ears of many other folk musicians and connecting Dylan with the civil rights movement and other protest groups of the era. But Dylan disliked being known as a protest singer and would quickly shed that side of his music, delving not only into more introspective lyricism and poetry, but heavier sounds as well. Dylan's transition into rock music around 1965 is considered to be the advent of folk rock as a genre, matching the beat poetry and now almost psychedelic-inspired lyricism with an almost electric blues backing wall of sound. And the result of this transition was not only an even bigger increase in Dylan's celebrity, but also a trifecta of records that are considered by many to be the best work of his career, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde, 3 albums that many people to this day consider to be among the apex of what folk music and rock music are all about. But if there's one theme that we find over and over again in Dylan's life, it's that the man hates adulation. Maybe not acclaim, but certainly the type of fandom and obsession that we might today call stan culture. Dylan was unhappy during this time. He became more dependent on drugs. He became more sensitive to the criticisms of his electric sound being made by folk purists. And just when everything seemed to be at a fever pitch in his career, in July 1966, Dylan crashed his motorcycle. While the injuries he suffered are still not entirely clear, Dylan has always claimed that the accident gave him perspective on just how quickly his life was moving. And it also gave him an excuse to get away from, as he put it, the rat race. And so we enter kind of a strange period of Dylan's career after that. He starts by recording a bunch of demos and jam sessions with his backing band at the time, which would later help kickstart what we call the bootleg industry today, becoming widely available as an illegal vinyl purchase. His band, by the way, would go on to have a respectable career themselves as The Band, and the demos would later be released officially as The Basement Tapes. Dylan's officially released output, meanwhile, would range from the beguiling John Wesley Harding to the hard pivot into country music with Nashville Skyline to Self-Portrait, a record that many people speculate was intentionally overly long and intentionally crafted poorly so that Dylan could reject his own fan base. But whatever you believe about his art, the truth is that Dylan at this time was fairly happy. He had married, he was the father of 4 children, and he was attempting at this point to lead a very private life, the life of a recluse, not really performing live at all during this time. In many ways, this was one of the happiest periods of his life. But when Dylan went back on tour with the band in 1974, his marriage became strained for reasons that have thankfully remained mostly private. What didn't remain private were Dylan's feelings about his marriage dissolving, which he poured out into what became, in many people's eyes, his comeback record, 1975's Blood on the Tracks. It was the first Dylan album in almost a decade to receive rapturous critical acclaim, and the release also coincided with the Rolling Thunder Review Tour that started that year, a sort of mega tour of smaller venues that Dylan did with other collaborators in the folk realm, like Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, Ramblin' Jack Elliott, etc., etc. But Dylan's personal life would take a downturn after this period. Once his divorce was finalized, by all accounts, he was miserable and became very difficult to work with in the studio and on the stage. After an epiphany that he had on stage during a concert in San Diego, Dylan made a sudden conversion to Christianity in late 1978, and his next few records that he put out would all become very reliant on Christian themes, which understandably polarized his remaining fan base. Dylan did ultimately move away from this, although he has remained a Christian to this day. Dylan steered towards more contemporary production styles during the 1980s as his sales figures waned and he sank deeper into drinking habits, with only a couple of real high points during this time, including his work with the supergroup the Traveling Wilburys, but not including his live tour with the Grateful Dead. The sales drought continued until the 1990s, when Dylan made a popular appearance on the TV show MTV Unplugged, and the accompanying live records sold very well. And he would ultimately follow that appearance with his most acclaimed studio record in decades, 1997's Time Out of Mind. It's at this point where Dylan's career pivoted from aging rocker attempting to stay relevant to aging rocker who can comfortably reflect on his age. While not every Dylan record since Time Out of Mind has been universally acclaimed, he did have those 3 Standards records that not everybody's crazy about, and don't forget about the Christmas album either. The records that he made of original content have been pretty consistently praised critically, and some of these are regarded as among his best pieces of writing ever. Beyond his studio records, Dylan has also been one of the most prolific issuers of archival material out there, thanks to his so-called bootleg series, which started back in the early 90s and has produced literally hundreds of compelling outtakes and unreleased songs. Dylan also performs live to this day as part of a collection of tours known as the Never Ending Tour, and his live performances are also widely bootlegged and shared amongst the Dylan faithful. There isn't much to be said about his personal life within the last 30-odd years. He's an extremely private man, and apart from a few isolated health scares, he appears to be in extremely good health for being 83 years old, and I hope he tours for much longer. And this is where I can talk about my own experience seeing Bob for the first time. Now, I have historically, my familiarity with this discography was I'd listened to it in full once before. I've heard several of these albums many times, but I had never necessarily considered myself a super fan of Bob Dylan, and so I'd never been able to say that I'd seen him live. I was able to see Bob live in Somerset, Wisconsin just a couple of weeks ago as part of the Outlaw Music Festival tour that Willie Nelson and his family put on. Dylan has been a part of at least this kind of leg of the tour for several months now, and it was one of those things where kind of combined, it was too good of an experience to pass up. So I went to Somerset, got to sit down there. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is one of the t-shirts that they were selling. This is the Tempest Tour t-shirt, because he was playing a couple songs from the Tempest record specifically. It was a great time. Southern Avenue was the opener. I thought they were extremely well done. I believe they were from Memphis, if memory serves, a 5 or a 6 piece. They really rocked the house down. John Mellencamp was next out. Never been a huge Mellencamp fan, but I thought he performed really solidly. Bob was the third act, and then Willie Nelson was the final act. I wasn't able to stay for the full Willie set, but for a man who's 91 years old, I thought he did phenomenally, and I'm hoping to explore his discography more in the near future as well. But the Bob show, to me, I think clearly was the highlight. I thought the band was on fire. I thought the reinterpretations of a lot of these songs were really compelling, and the actual experience of it seemed, Bob has this reputation as being kind of an ornery performer, And he has bad nights and he has good nights and that sort of thing. And it seems like we caught him on a good night. He seemed to be enjoying himself. There's some videos from the concert where it seemed like he's even like smiling a couple times. He talked to the audience like once, which I guess is really good for him. And he pulled out some really solid songs. The opener, Silvio, hadn't been played in 20 years. The version of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall was phenomenal. I got chills from that. And, you know, hearing some of these other tracks, both the, you know, stuff like Simple Twist of Fate, Ballad of a Thin Man, which he closed on, and even some of the deeper cuts like fucking Under a Red Sky, being pulled out. It was just really, really something to experience. And like I say, I think he's in good health. I hope he continues touring for a long time, and I hope I get to see him again. But if this is it, if this is the one experience I had, I know Stephen Hayden, writer who I have a lot of respect for, was at the show and said it was one of the best Dylan concerts he has ever seen, one of the most emotional Dylan concerts he's ever seen. If this is my one time getting to experience Bob Dylan in that setting, I'm grateful as hell. So really happy that I got to experience that. All right, let's get to the ranking. So there are 40 studio albums that will be ranked here. We are including the 2 soundtrack albums, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and Shadow Kingdom among them. No live records are being included here. I'm not head over heels for any Dylan live album, admittedly. Before the Flood might be the best, and I think it certainly has some of his best live vocals ever. Plus, having the band backing him is really cool. I also think Real Live is really good. A lot of people don't like that one, but I think it's nice to hear him play these songs mostly straight and not in the sort of pseudo reggae fashion that he does on Live at Budokan, or in the generally fucked up way that Dylan and the Dead is. Just, that's an atrocious record as far as I'm concerned. We're also not including any bootleg series entries in this list. Fair warning, I've not listened to all of the bootleg series. I've heard the first 8 volumes in full though, and I actually think they're all great, but I think the most essential ones in that list would be the first set, volumes 1 through 3, and then volume 8, Telltale Signs, if you're mostly wanting studio outtakes. And then you'd be looking for volume 4, the Royal Albert Hall concert, and volume 6, the concert at Philharmonic Hall, if you're looking for the essential live recordings. But the bootleg versions, the bootleg series recordings that I've heard, for the most part, all great. All right, 40 albums. Let's get it started. My number 40 is going to be 1986's Knocked Out Loaded. Okay. This is probably the one Bob Dylan record that I would safely say that I dislike. I do not like this record at all. We'll talk about his other 80s stuff. We'll talk about Infidels, and we'll talk about Empire Burlesque, and we'll talk about kind of the production roles, the role that production plays in those records not being as good as they could be. But Knocked Out Loaded feels like a distillation of the worst parts of Empire Burlesque, but again, spread across a full album. There's not a single song here that I would genuinely come back to. Brownsville Girl is considered to be the major highlight, and for sure it's clearly the best song on here. But I think if I want an 11-minute Dylan track, there are other lengthier Dylan songs with more compelling subjects, with more interesting aesthetics that I'd be likelier to come back to. And Brownsville Girl, a song that I'm not like over the moon about in general, is not close to being enough to saving this record. Production sounds trashy. Like some of the worst aspects of the 80s are here. The song selection is all over the place, and some of the creative choices that Dylan uses to augment those songs are really bizarre. Chris Christopherson's They Killed Him is on this record. I think this is the one people kind of pull out as an example of how bad this album is, and there's damn good reason for it. They Killed Him is awful. One of my least favorite Bob Dylan songs. One of my least favorite songs he ever recorded, that is. The Children's Choir is super grating. Yeah, there's nothing here that I would want to come back to. There's a lot of Dylan records that I'm going to be very kind to, but unfortunately this late 80s stuff where the motivation is clearly gone is not going to be included. in that list. So Knocked Out Loaded is my number 40. All right, number 39, I have 1988's Down in the Groove. I definitely like this one more than Knocked Out Loaded. These two records are very commonly at the bottom of most people's lists, and that's kind of interchangeable as far as which record goes where for those people. For me, I think this is clearly better, but not by a ton. I think this record still suffers from the same creative lack of inspiration. Feels like it's retreading ground rather than treading new ground. Song selection here is weak for the most part. I do think Silvio is the best. It is kind of funny going back to my own concert experience that I experienced both tracks from, like Highway 61 Revisited and Blood on the Tracks and Bringing It All Back Home. And I also experienced a song from fucking Down in the Groove. So you want to talk about the kaleidoscope, the cornucopia of songs that you could experience at a Bob Dylan concert. I mean, hard to get any more kaleidoscopic than that. Anyways, I think what puts this one over the edge for me is I think this leans into the sort of groovier, rootsier, bluesier sounds that I think Dylan likes more and I think suits him better. I think this record in some ways is a bit of a dry run for what he's going to do in the early 90s with some of his traditional records, but I don't think this album hits the mark at all, and I also don't think his vocals are any good on it. So still skip this one, but this one I wouldn't say I overly dislike as much as I do Knocked Out Loaded. So number 39 for Down in the Groove. Number 38, I have 1973's Dylan. This is an absolute nothing burger of an album, a record that was released by Columbia without Dylan's involvement whatsoever to complete his recording contract with them at the time. These recordings are entirely outtakes from Self-Portrait and New Morning, and it's the type of material that would absolutely be fodder for a bootleg series volume if it had been left in the vaults. But I don't even think it would be high quality bootleg series volumes. A lot of this is like warm up tracks and things that Dylan would do before recording the songs that he and the band came to record during this time. So you have, entirely covers. His version of Lily of the West is nice. And I think his version of the Ballad of Ivor Hayes is nice, but then you get stuff like Mr. Bojangles and A Fool Such as I that I don't really think work. His version of Big Yellow Taxi I'm not really a fan of. It's nothing that I can hate. A lot of people put this one at the bottom as well because they're just offended by its mere existence. And I understand that, but not something that I can really muster any feelings towards one way or the other. So it gets to number 38. I think almost his entire discography is better, but I think it just exists. Number 37, I have 1990's Under the Red Sky, a record that should have been better. I think if we're talking like biggest Dylan record disappointments, if you will, this has got to be up there. Don Was produces this one. I respect Don Was as a producer and as a musician, but I think this is one of the most generic sounding Dylan records. And the output that Dylan gives, especially coming off the heels of Oh Mercy, which, spoiler alert, is a phenomenal album, Dylan is kind of like back in the rut of Down in the Groove here, with a couple of inspired moments. I think the title track, and especially Born in Time, are great. I love Born in Time. I really like the version that Clapton did on his album Pilgrim, a record that I think is very underrated. But apart from that, I mean, you pair these with songs like Wiggle Wiggle and 10,000 Men and Handy Dandy. You're mixing these like songs that I think are, if not top shelf Dylan, I think, still tapping into these lyrical insights that make Dylan ingenious. And you're mixing them with these like nursery rhyme, child-friendly tracks. And it just leads to a very kind of frustrating listening experience for the listener. And yeah, I don't know what to say. It's not good. It's not bad per se, but you're left wanting more with Under the Red Sky, which is why it's number 37. Number 36, I have 1980s Saved. I'm going to be kind to the Christian records relative to how I've been in the past. Since revisiting his discography, I think they have all grown on me to some extent, some more than others. And in this case, I think Saved has absolutely grown the least on me. I think this can be attributed to the production, not even the production, it doesn't sound bad, but I think this compared to the other two, I think Slow Train Coming and Shot of Love lean more into rock sounds. Saved leans a bit more into kind of the traditional gospel sound, and it leans into some of the same problems that I have with late 70s Dylan in general, which is how overwrought I think a lot of that material is. And it's magnified here, I think, by the actual songs themselves not necessarily being my cup of tea personally. I think that Covenant Woman is good. Pressing On is solid. What Can I Do For You? There's moments here that I am fine with and on principle, but the overall sound to this record, combined with, again, just kind of the preachiness and the judgment in the lyrics on these Christian records, which is one of the biggest turnoffs for me across the board, it just kind of means that this is not a record I'm ever going to sit down and listen to for pleasure. Not bad, but, and we're starting to get into things that I think are genuinely kind of decent, but there's a lot here that kind of turns me off. So Saved comes in at number 36. Number 35, I have 2009's Christmas in the Heart. This was at my bottom. This Dylan's Christmas record is a not a sight to behold, but certainly something to listen to. It is an oral treat to listen to this ragged, almost 70-year-old voice who sounds like, Tom Waits gone off the deep end, trying to sing these traditional Christmas songs. It's wild. It's hilarious. And before I was like, this is terrible. Absolutely the worst thing he's ever done, at my bottom. Having re-listened to his stuff and gained more of an appreciation for the arc of his career, and specifically how much inspiration he takes from older music and how much of a student of American musical history he is, this record has grown on me. The arrangements here are very, very true to the Bing Crosby versions of a lot of these songs. Stuff like Do You Hear What I Hear? Songs like that. I think Dylan clearly has a love and affection for this music, and he's playing it extremely straight. The only reason that it's funny is because, haha, Dylan's voice sounds bad, but he's taking this as serious as it gets, while also having fun with it because he clearly enjoys the music. It's nothing that I would recommend for the average person, but as someone who has become a lot more of a Dylan fan over time, I've gained appreciation for it. It has a bit of a soft spot in my heart now. I can't objectively put it much higher, but the playing itself is well done, and I think Dylan is getting the most out of it for himself. And hearing Dylan have fun makes me have a little bit of fun. So, number 35, Christmas in the Heart. Number 34, I have 1985's Empire Burlesque. This is a record that a lot of people can't stand. If we think of like the popular conception of what the nadir of Bob Dylan's career is, that album cover encapsulates it, I think, for a lot of people. Dylan trying to pivot into a commercially friendly sound because he knows his sales are slipping, and doing so while like clearly being kind of like out of it in a lot of ways, just out of touch with reality and what have you. And I think that's a little bit unfair. It's partially true. This is absolutely the most commercial record Bob Dylan has ever released under any circumstances. The most brazenly commercial anyways. But I think what you get with that are, it's one of the more interesting explorations of Dylan as a writer. him trying to consciously write pop songs it's kind of fascinating to watch. Stuff like Tight Connection to My Heart, which admittedly I don't like that song all that much, but it's probably one of the better ones here. I'll Remember You, When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky, Emotionally Yours, Dark Eyes, of course. You know, it's not, none of this is top shelf Dylan material. I think this is a remarkably consistently fine album. And certainly the production choices are dated by a lot of today's standards, a lot of contemporary keyboard sounds and that sort of thing, that very much mark it in a specific time and place. But I think about the record that came before it, Infidels, a record that's going to be much higher on my list. And I think, you know, that album, Empire Burlesque, is really actually a very logical step forward from Infidels in a lot of ways. It takes maybe the worst aspects of Infidels' production sound and applies it there in the same way that Knocked Out Loaded is going to do to Empire Burlesque. But I think that, you know, Dylan is moving away from the types of epics that he was writing still occasionally on, like Infidels, and was clearly trying to dip his toes into the commercial waters already. And I think this is the logical culmination of it. And I don't think it's embarrassing. I think it's very much midlife crisis, but there are far worse midlife crisis records to have come out in the mid-'80s than this, as far as I'm concerned. So take it with a grain of salt. Empire Burlesque, it's my number 34. Not bad. Number 33, I have 1970s Self-Portrait. What to think of this record? I honestly don't know that I have that much to say about Self-Portrait. It is a record that has been exhaustively talked about as far as being a so-called low point of Bob Dylan's career, and a record that famously got the critic Grail Marcus to evoke, quote, "What is this shit?" And I think it is certainly overhated in the sense that I think the initial reaction to Self-Portrait's release was so negative in, you know, from a lot of popular critics at the time, Marcus and Rolling Stone, Robert Christgau, for the Village Voice and that sort of thing. You know, I think that response has tainted this record's reputation in, like, over the last 50 plus years or so. I don't think it's that bad. I think it's actually okay. The biggest issue that I have with Self-Portrait is the length of it. I don't think the material here is strong enough to warrant a record that is, you know, over almost an hour and 15 minutes long. And also, I think the live recordings that are mixed in are just take you out of kind of the whole feel of it. I think if it had been stripped down to the studio tracks in and of themselves, it still would probably be Dylan's worst record of the time, but I do think that it would have felt more like a logical follow-up to something like Nashville Skyline, even if it was a lesser follow-up. But because of whatever reasons you want to attribute to Dylan releasing this record in the way that it was, intentionally making it long, intentionally making it sloppy because he wanted to get rid of the adulation that was just surrounding him even as he was trying to get away from it. You know, whatever reasons you want to attribute to that, it came out the way that it did. And it's listenable. It's listenable. It's fine. But I can't, this is another record that I can't really emote too much more on because I don't have the energy to hate it. And I think there are some very good songs in here, but I don't have the energy to love it, and I don't have the energy to advocate for it as this lost classic. So it comes in where it does. Number 32, I have 1981's Shot of Love. Shot of Love is a record that I wish I liked more than I did. It did grow on me. And this is the first Dylan record on this list where I'm tempted to say that overall I have positive opinions on it. But Shot of Love, it pivots back into the more rock-focused sounds of Slow Train Coming. It pivots away from what Saved had turned into, which I like. And I like the sound of these songs, and I like the instrumentation here for the most part. I don't mind the production. I think some people criticize the production of this record. I don't really mind it. My biggest beef is Dylan's vocals. Now, Dylan as a vocalist is obviously very polarizing. People will constantly imitate and make memes of the voice that he was doing around like the Blonde on Blonde era. But I, for the most part, defend him as a singer, at least now. And I think actually he's subtly a really, really, a very conscious and intentional singer, whose natural tone of his voice makes it sound like he kind of just doesn't give a shit. But I actually think there's a lot of intention in so many of his performances, even to this day. Shot of Love is the one where I can't get it. I can't get into it. I think his voice is whiny here. It's very shrill. And it really takes all these songs down a notch here for me as well. Still some solid tracks. And actually, I think the closing track, Every Grain of Sand, is genuinely great. One of the first truly great songs that we've talked about here so far. But again, I'm held back from appreciating this one as much as I want to. I do think it's going to be a grower. I wouldn't be surprised if it jumps up on my list in the future. But for right now, Shot of Love sits there at number 32. Number 31 is going to be probably one of the more controversial takes that I have, but shouldn't be surprising if you watch this video in full up to this point. I have 1978 Street Legal. Street Legal, so when I say that, if you paid attention, you would understand. I already said earlier when talking about Saved that the late 70s very overwrought sound that Bob Dylan was incorporating into both his live shows and his studio records at that point was not something that I enjoyed. And Street Legal is the guiltiest studio record of that. His live stuff like Budokan or what have you, or like the later Rolling Thunder tours are worse, arguably. But Street Legal is a very massive record. It is a very busy record with a lot going on, and it radiates divorced energy. I think fundamentally these are good songs. There's actually a lot of songs on here that I think are at least good. Changing of the Guards, I think, is great. Is Your Love in Vain, I think, is good. But I think so much is kind of drowned out by the massive kind of contemporary late 70s instrumentation. Again, the female backing vocalists that are all over the place, which I should highlight. I don't pick on backing vocalists or specifically female backing vocalists because I think they're inherently a bad thing. I pick on the usage of that as a trope to by, I think, specifically white male artists in order to, lend some sort of, passion or extra oomph or extra merit to a song that doesn't necessarily deserve it. I think it's a very kind of trite trope in general, and I think people are not very intentional with how they use them, and I think that's a disservice, not just to the music, but I think to the singers as well. Anyways, I'm not a fan of the sound of this record. I think it's too busy. There's a lot going on. I wouldn't be surprised, again, if this one grows on me over time. I do know people who absolutely adore it. But this one does hit a few pet peeves that makes me not appreciate the generally strong songs underneath all of this as much as I probably could. So Street Legal comes in at number 31. Number 30, I have 1992's Good As I Been to You. I don't have much to say about this. I like the turn, the pivot that Dylan was taking at this time, kind of reconnecting with his roots and covering these traditional blues and folk songs with this record and the one following it. Good As I've Been to You, I think maybe dips a little bit at times into the kind of kiddie music territory that Under the Red Sky does, stuff like Froggy Went a Courtin', Kennedy I.O., that sort of thing. But at its core, especially with the tracks like Frankie and Albert, Arthur McBride, Blackjack Davy, really like Blackjack Davy, you get a sense, again, not only into kind of the ethos of Dylan as a performer and as a musical mind, but you also get to see another aspect of him that I think is underrated, which is his acoustic guitar playing. I think his guitar playing on this record is terrific for the most part. And hearing Dylan very kind of isolated, you know, just him and the guitar, kind of that focus is really rewarding and really appreciated after the denseness that is the 80s records. So I can't in good consciousness put it any higher than this, but I do think that this record is a breath of fresh air and a little bit underrated by the general public. So number 30 for Good As I've Been to You. Number 29, I have 1973's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. This is a record I think is also very underrated by many people because it suffers from the Yellow Submarine syndrome, I suppose, the Beatles soundtrack album, in that half of the record is instrumental. So by definition, people don't care about half the record because they're coming to Dylan for Dylan. They're coming to Dylan for his lyrics and that sort of thing. And I understand that. I also think it's superficial. I think the same thing about Yellow Submarine. I don't think the soundtrack side of Yellow Submarine is superb, but I think people writing it off is just lazy. And I think the same thing with this. I think the melodies of the instrumental pieces here and the thematic ideas are very interesting. I think they actually highlight how good of a melodist Dylan is. The fact that he's penning the stuff like, you know, the Billy theme that recurs over and over again. I think that's a great motif. Turkey Chase, I think, is really entertaining. Knocking on Heaven's Door is arguably his most famous song. Certainly, I think his most successful song in many ways. I don't like it as much as most of his other big name songs, is what I'll say. I think it's great, but I've never had the same like goosebumps moment with this track that I have a lot of his 60s material or like Blood on the Tracks stuff, or even some of his later songs. It's kind of, I feel like I'm held at arm's length with appreciating that track as much as a lot of people do. So I call that out. That's my own personal barrier towards potentially even placing this record even higher. But it is what it is. I think this, you know, is worth reevaluating if you are a Dylan fan. If you have familiarized yourself with a lot of his other stuff, a lot of his other kind of lyrical moments and things like that, I think revisit this record with a fresh outlook. I think it'll surprise you. Number 28, I have 1993's World Gone Wrong, the other kind of acoustic covers record that Dylan wrote, or that Dylan recorded in the early 90s. The difference between this and Good As I've Been to You is I think the song selection here is better. I also think the recording is not, I don't know if I would say it's better, but I do think that it highlights the sort of rawness of it. There are moments where you can like so audibly hear like Dylan like breathing into the mic and just kind of fiddling around. And I think those moments are cool. I like the blues covers. I like Ragged and Dirty. I like Blood in My Eyes, Jackaro, Delia, maybe the best song on here. It has a lot of the same strengths as Good As I've Been to You, but without as much of the kind of nursery rhyme material that invades that record from time to time. And this one, again, I think in particular feels more like a step up, like he's ramping up his own reflections into what would become this mid to late 90s career renaissance. So it's my number 28. It's not top shelf Dylan by any stretch of the imagination, but I think those two early 90s records are actually quite underrated, even if they weren't the biggest sellers. Number 27, I have 2016's Fallen Angels, the first of the 3 standards records that I'm including in my list, the second one chronologically. I am going to stand up for the standards records, certainly. Again, not that I'm going to put any of them especially high on this type of a list, but I do think that there is something really special about hearing Dylan connecting with this music that clearly defined his childhood. Fallen Angels, I think, is maybe the least successful of the 3 in my eyes, purely because I think both Shadows in the Night and Triplicate rely more on slower material to kind of steer the ship. Fallen Angels is a little bit more kind of upbeat, a little bit more, dare I say, trivial. And I think that's a little bit more outside of Dylan's comfort zone. And if nothing else, I think it maybe diminishes the seriousness of, you know, and with that, the seriousness of the records, and in doing so, part of the reason why they appeal to me. But it's not major. I mean, this is also me probably putting a magnifying glass and completely augmenting these reasons to try to justify why I have one lower than the others by a few spots. I still think it's really well played. I still think Dylan as an interpreter, I mean, he's limited because he's a man in his mid-70s and probably was never fit to be a standard singer in the first place. But I think what he does is nice. I like his versions of tracks like Polka Dots and Moonbeams, All or Nothing at All, It Had to Be You, That Old Black Magic. You know, a lot of classic tunes on here that I think he performs effectively. And I think this is a very pleasant record. And if it is my least favorite of those three standards records, it's not by a huge margin. I still think it's enjoyable. Number 26, I have 2009's Together Through Life. This feels like one of the most forgotten about Dylan records in his entire catalog, which is not to say that it's poor or even that mediocre. I think this is a solidly good album. But the issue with Together Through Life compared to everything else is it has to compete with everything else. And I mean his other late career originals records. In a lot of ways, I think Together Through Life has the same strengths of something like Modern Times, but without the stronger songwriting that uplifts Modern Times. I don't think this is, I think, by far his weakest batch of songs of any of his original records from the 2000s and onward. A lot of songs that are like interpolations of traditional blues songs and things like that. It's definitely dark, and at this point, Dylan's voice is becoming about as ragged as it will ever be. It's the same ragged voice you get on the Christmas record, and it's the same ragged voice that I think really uplifts something like Tempest just a few years later. But you get scratches of that here, which I think is the one positive distinction between this and a Love and Theft or a Modern Times that I think works in its favor. But I don't know. There's not much here. Like Beyond Here Lies Nothing. If you ever go to Houston, I Feel a Change Coming On. I think those are tracks that might make it onto like a Dylan playlist, but a lot of this is solidly like B or C tier Dylan material, especially for this era. So it's fine. You know, not, it's good even, I would say. But it's one of those things, it's the whole, like, it's the, you know, we have Modern Times at home kind of record, I think. If I'm going to choose between this and any of the other 2000s Dylan records, I'm probably never going to be choosing this. Number 25, I have the self-titled debut record from 1962, going all the way to the beginning. Okay. Bob, at the beginning of his career, you know, this record is, I think a lot of people view it as kind of a warm-up record for what would come afterwards. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying I do think that underrates Bob Dylan as an album a little bit. I think Dylan already at this point, even if he's not writing the majority of these songs, is a very compelling performer. Part of that is his voice. I think the man has a voice that I think is like a gift from God, which is probably a strange thing to say about a man with that, you know, with a voice that is not traditionally rich or pure or warm or great or anything like that. But he demands attention, even as a 21-year-old recording this record. He demands attention. He's interpreting this material effectively and passionately. And even when he gets into his original songs, like, I think Song to Woody is fantastic. And combining that precociousness with his guitar playing, and again, that vocal delivery. And I think this is a record that, even if this ended up being the only thing he ever released, which would obviously change the whole course of music history in innumerable ways, even if this was the only thing he released, I think this is one of those records that you have people on YouTube or Rate Your Music or other forums or stuff talk about as like, hey, here's an underrated gem from 1962, this Bob Dylan guy. Actually, a really good record. You should check it out. It would be, if you think about Rate Your Music, a website, the esoteric charts or whatever they are, this is a record that would be geared towards that if it was an isolated release. Thankfully, it isn't. And I certainly don't think it's among his strongest records of the 60s. In fact, I think this is fairly clearly the least interesting or compelling record he did in the 60s. But that is much more to the credit of everything else he released in that decade than it is a detriment of this album. Number 24, I have 2023's Shadow Kingdom, the other soundtrack in the most recent album that Dylan has put out so far to this point. Shadow Kingdom is an interesting record in that I think if you yourself are someone who has not been able to see Dylan live in the last few years and is wondering what a Dylan live performance might sound like in the year of our Lord 2024, this record is the one that will most accurately reflect that. It's a lot of reinterpretations of songs of his, many of them classics, some of them a little bit more kind of obscure under the radar. And it's reinterpretations with, people in his band or people who have played with him for a long time. T-Bone Burnett and Don Was are both on here. And it's done in the style that Dylan kind of reinterprets these songs. Like, for instance, when I think of It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and how he records it on this album, where it's very like slow and they're playing like individual chords and vamping on them while Dylan just kind of spits out the lyrics. Very similar to the versions of songs like Hard Rain's Gonna Fall and Simple Twist of Fate that I heard when I saw Dylan. And it's very, and a lot of that I think is jazz influenced. I think these are the after effects of the performances he did on the Standards records, kind of infiltrating his live sets, which I think is really cool. Again, am I going to choose any of these over the original versions of these tracks? No. I mean, there's a limiting factor with that. But people, I think people shit on covers albums just in general as a concept, especially the idea of people re-recording their own material. And again, I think that's kind of a lazy way of thinking. And this record proves it. I think these are drastic reinterpretations of these songs. I think they are necessary reinterpretations if you want to understand Bob Dylan as not just an artist, but as a long-lived artist, someone who has lived 60 years, has recorded for 60 years. It feels like a culmination of that. And I hope it's not the last record he ever puts out, but I think as a closing statement, paired with Rough and Rowdy Ways as his closing artistic expression of new material, I think Shadow Kingdom works really effectively in that role. So if this is the end, a really nice way to go out on. Number 23, I have 2017's Triplicate. I really like this album. Like I said, the Standards records I think get shat on a little bit too much. I'm still not putting this in the top half of his discography, obviously, but Triplicate and these Standards records just capture something so joyous and so earnest about Dylan's musical knowledge, his musical experience, and his musical heritage that I can't help but just have this huge soft spot for them. The thing that puts Triplicate down compared to Shadows in the Night specifically, which obviously I have higher, is simply its length. It's an hour and a half long. I am not going to be making intentional time to be listening to an hour and a half long Dylan record under most circumstances, but especially not something like this. That said, the actual recordings here of tracks like Stormy Weather, How Deep is the Ocean, There's a Flaw in My Flu, Why Was I Born? I mean, there's some gut-punching stuff, some really fantastic recordings that are wedged in here, that are, contained in this record that is intimidating on the surface, but actually has plenty of gems caught up inside of it. So Don't write off triplicate if you're intimidated by the length. I think there's a lot to love here. Again, kind of like the Christmas record, Dylan is taking cues from Sinatra in a lot of these arrangements. So Sinatra has recorded many of the tracks on this record and the previous two. So again, that respect for kind of the people who came before him, I think, is really interesting and really entertaining. So well worth checking out. Underrated. If you didn't click with it the first time around, give it another shot. I think it has a lot to offer. Number 22, I have 1975's The Basement Tapes. Boy, this album, I'm not sure I really have enough words to talk about it, because I don't entirely know how to talk about it. The Basement Tapes have such a convoluted and confusing history, a history that requires you not only to understand the context of the album's recording, but also of the career arcs of both Bob Dylan and the band after the fact, and the context of the Basement Tapes themselves and how they were bootlegged over the years and how they were distributed and how Dylan's team kind of reacted to it by trying to quash the bootlegs before eventually realizing, hey, like, we're not going to be able to do this. We need to find a time to officially release it. And then in the midst of all this, the band decided to add like some of their own songs that they recorded independently onto this record for mass distribution. It's very convoluted, it's very confusing, and it leads to a record that I wish I liked more than I did. It's still really good, and the material with Dylan and the band on here is fascinating. It certainly feels like the missing link between something like Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding, since that, again, early 67, that's late 66, early 67, that's the era it was recorded. But man, I think, and I like the band. I think their 1975 record, Northern Lights, Southern Cross, is one of their best efforts. But the random band songs that are just kind of thrown out throughout the record that were not recorded in 67, that were recorded in the 70s by themselves with no involvement from Bob Dylan, it takes you out of it. It like, not as much as maybe you'd think. I think the engineering and production on here does a decent enough job to make it sound like it comes from the same sessions. But yeah, I don't know. It's something to kind of go back and forth between hearing like Dylan on a song like This Wheel's on Fire or Tears of Rage or something, just elevating the material, and then going from that to like Levon Helm talking about bread, you know, or whatever. It's so jarring. And I think I've not listened to the complete Basement Tapes, the kind of bootleg series re-release or whatever it is. I want to do it at some point because I think that will give me more appreciation for this era. And again, I think the stuff like, you know, Going to Acapulco, Tears of Rage, This Wheel's on Fire, a lot of stuff that the band would end up recording later on, or earlier on, as the case may be. I think a lot of that stuff is really strong, but as a cohesive listen, I don't know that it works that well, which is why I kind of have to cap it here at number 22. But important album for understanding the Bob Dylan story, understanding the band story, and all that other stuff. So would check it out. I would recommend. Number 21, I have 2015's Shadows in the Night. This is the first of the 3 standards records, and it is ultimately my favorite. I think the reason for that is partially in comparison to Triplicate. It's obviously, you know, a third the length, basically. And compared to Fallen Angels, I think that Dylan's focus on the saloon songs of Sinatra, since again, that's the aim here, is to kind of capture Sinatra arrangements and things like that. I think him capturing the saloon material more specifically works entirely to this record's benefit. I think it's really effective, really great. And the arrangements on here, which also I should say are a larger ensemble than what you get on something like Fallen Angels, which is like a small group setting. These are like full kind of almost orchestral arrangements backing him. And again, Dylan is limited in his what he can do as an interpreter of these songs because he is a 73, 74-year-old man. But, he's clearly trying to emulate Sinatra's phrasing as much as he can. And he is, showing a knowledge of the songs and a knowledge of the meaning of the songs that is powerful in a way that only an older person seeing those lyrics could be. So stuff like The Night We Called It a Day, Autumn Leaves, Where Are You, That Lucky Old Sun, just so much that I think is just superb. The combination of the arrangements and his fragmented voice, I think, is just perfect. This is definitely an era where I almost wish I'd been able to see some of his like jazz stuff live, just to see kind of how that translated into a live setting. I'm not super familiar with his set list from this era. I don't know how much of his set lists were dominated by the standards material, but certainly I think it would be interesting to just watch it happen in real time. But Shadows in the Night, underrated, as are all the other standards records, and it comes in at number 21. Number 20, I have 1979's Slow Train Coming, the first of the 3 Christian records, and my favorite of them by a sizable margin. Couple reasons for that. Number one, I think the instrumentation and the playing on this record is genuinely superb. Mark Knopfler is the backbone of this record. I'm a big Mark Knopfler fan. Really like Dire Straits, and I think that his guitar playing adds so much texture to these tracks. But I also think compared to something like Street Legal, this feels so much more stripped back and so much more like a just solid late 70s, rock record. Not a heavy one, but just kind of a casual one. That core would withstand a lot of lyrical ideas. And because of that, I think it is able to withstand Dylan's, severe pivot into Christian imagery that he goes through with on this record. And I still think the lyrics on this record are more compelling than the other two, because while they are judgmental and a bit like holier than thou, I suppose, like very strong statements from a guy who just converted to Christianity like months prior. I think the cynicism hits well enough on this record to where like it does feel like the true emotions of a recent convert, someone who has not been brought up in the faith, someone who is not convinced that everything is like rosy, that everything associated with the religion is kind of rosy and nice, but someone who also sees kind of the downsides, the pitfalls, the kind of consequences for what happens if you don't essentially get your act together. I think in these lyrics, I don't think Dylan is casting judgment on others so much as I think he's also casting judgment on himself a little bit. And by talking about sinners and all that shit, if he's not also really directing anger and self-hatred at himself for maybe how he acted the previous few years. That could be a totally off-base interpretation of this, but that was kind of the sense I got when I re-listened to this. Several great songs on here. Gotta Serve Somebody is really great. Slow Train. I like Do Right to Me, Baby. Man Gave Names to All the Animals is funny. I don't dislike that one. I used to hate it, but I think it's more humorous than anything now. Yeah, Slow Train Coming. I don't know. It's a very strange record. It's an odd bird. And he never captures this energy in his other Christian records or really in any other album. But I really like it, and I expect this one will also probably continue to grow on me over time. Okay, number 19 is where I possibly lose everybody. It's probably the most controversial opinion that I have, and this may change at some point. So I just wanted people to know that before I say it. My number 19 is 1976's Desire. I think that Desire is about half a really great, really terrific record. Give me Hurricane. Hurricane, I think, is spectacular. It's one of the best songs that he wrote in the 1970s, maybe ever. Really powerful, really evocative track. I really like Isis. One More Cup of Coffee is great. Really love Emmylou Harris's backing vocals on that one. And I think Sarah, the closer, is really great. And I might even be partial to something like Romance in Durango. But then you get stuff like Mozambique and Oh Sister, which I think are fine. Dylan is definitely playing the role of like world traveler here, and dare I say it, I even hear a little bit of like yacht rock influence or precursor material in some of the instrumentation choices here. So that's kind of an interesting little thing that makes me like, I don't know, it makes me view this record in an interesting light and maybe a more trivial light than it deserves to be. And then there's Joey. I don't want to go on a rant about Joey, but suffice to say, Joey is one of my least favorite Bob Dylan songs, probably in general. I think the combination of the lyrical matter just kind of being so off base, combined with the sheer length of the track, and probably combined with that version on whatever it was it Dylan in the Dead? I think it was Dylan in the Dead. The version of it on that record, I think that version, I think, played a huge factor in me hating the song as much as I do. But Joey is the anchor around this record's neck that I think kills it from being a top shelf Dylan album for me. Because I think the records above it, for the most part, do not have any songs that miss in the way that that track does, and this record does. Again, I think Dylan, like I say, it's partially phenomenal, and some of this is genuinely some of Dylan's best lyrical material. And I do like that there's an element of contentment here, because this is kind of a come-up record after Blood on the Tracks. I think he and his wife Sarah were on better terms around this time, although that quickly changed. So I appreciate it in that sense, but I don't necessarily view it for my own personal tastes as the classic follow-up to Blood on the Tracks that some people do. I think it's missing something, and maybe with some rearrangements in the track order or what have you, this could be something that's a little bit more to my taste. But unfortunately, I think Joey in particular is what prevents me from saying this is an absolute top shelf Dylan record. But that said, again, it has a lot of top shelf Dylan material in it. So I think overall it is still well worth checking out. And if you like it more than I do, then phenomenal. Number 18, I have 2006's Modern Times. Very much in the same tradition as something like Love and Theft. This record has a lot of kind of blues, traditional kind of folk or country rock influence tracks that feature Dylan kind of reaching into his roots a little bit, but then coming out the other side with original material. Now, I say original material, probably with some quotation marks added. There's a lot of tracks on here that are clearly just interpolations of traditional blues songs that Dylan has changed just a tiny bit. So, you know, like take that with a grain of salt. I don't think it's maybe quite as successful as something like Love and Theft is, just because maybe I don't find the material as compelling, maybe in part because of that more covers influence concept, I suppose. But I can't deny that this record sounds great. I think the playing is really great. I think there is a bit of a moodier and darker edge to it that Love and Theft doesn't have quite as much. Love and Theft, I think for the most part, is a pretty upbeat record. This one isn't as much. And I think in that sense, Modern Times is useful in paving the way for, again, the late 2000s and the 2010s type of Dylan, which is, for the most part, I think very kind of dark and ruminating. So I really respect it in that sense. I'm not quite at the point where I would consider this top shelf Dylan either. It's very good. I think I need some more time with it. I think this one needs to grow on me a little bit more as well. But I really respect it a lot for what it is. This one did actually grow on me a lot from kind of first listen to second listen. So Modern Times at number 18, very respectable placement. Really like that record and recommend checking it out. Number 17, I have 1964's The Times They Are A-Changin'. This is Dylan's most protest-heavy record, most protest music-heavy record. It basically is the product of the wash and wave of popularity that Dylan grew into after Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, after his appearance at places like Newport Folk Festival and the March on Washington with Joan Baez and all that. This is Dylan as protest figure. This is Dylan as the singer of songs, as the kind of leader of a generation. And it's a title that Dylan didn't want from very early on. And yet, Dylan steps up to the plate and delivers a swath of tracks here that are very passionate, very genuine in their emotions, and several of them stand in the all-time list as far as the greatest protest songs ever. Certainly the title track does, With God on Our Side, Only a Pawn in Their Game. It's really kind of a stunning record in that sense. I think the reason why Times They Are A-Changin' is not higher on my personal list is because the material on it and the subject matter on it dates it to a certain era. And like I compare something like Blowin' in the Wind, which is a very general track and speaks to these kind of larger ideas about injustice and kind of not having the answer to that injustice at all. Like, it's like the answer is in front of us, but we can't put our finger on what it is, that sort of thing. And compare that to tracks like Ballad of Hollis Brown and The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, tracks that are very, at their core, very about specific events in history. And in doing that, I think Dylan, I don't want to criticize Dylan doing that, but I do think it makes the record a little bit less applicable on a kind of generational level, and more so a record that was geared for the times and meant for the times, and doesn't necessarily apply as well after the times have passed, after the times have changed. That's nitpicking, and it doesn't take away from the actually incredibly strong songwriting that's on here. I think everything on here is at least good, if not really good to great. But at this point, we're getting into the point where all of these albums I think are genuinely great, if not fantastic, and we're getting into kind of nitpicking reasons why one is lower than the other. But there's no doubt about it, The Times They Are Changing is an extremely important record in Dylan's evolution, certainly, but I think more so kind of the evolution of folk music as a whole. And I think it is a landmark genre achievement that may not be a landmark achievement in Dylan's wider catalog, if that makes sense. Number 16, I have 1970's New Morning. New Morning, a record made in kind of two different contexts that also happen to occur simultaneously. The context number one is Dylan's period of kind of domestic bliss, as it were. This is Dylan making records that he wants to make. This is Dylan making records that reflect kind of what he wants out of life and his satisfaction in life. This is also a record that comes out immediately after Self-Portrait is a huge commercial stinker, a huge critical failure, certainly. And Columbia and Dylan's management presumably wanted to kind of assuage the concerns of this kind of PR disaster that's happened. And so New Morning, as a result, comes out, and it's immediately extremely well reviewed and kind of soothes the concerns of the devoted faithful. And so with that context, it makes it seem like New Morning is kind of this thing that was shat out pretty quickly just to fulfill obligations, to make people happy. But I don't really think that's true. This does feel like a Dylan who is still engaged with the material and is having fun with it. And the tracks that he's writing on here, stuff like If Not For You, which of course George Harrison would go on to cover very famously that same year. The Man in Me, title track. I think there's some really great bits of songwriting, but for the most part, I think the appeal of this record is just kind of the blissful aspect of it. It is breezy, but there's also more intention than I think it seems on the surface. There are tracks that are made fun of, like Winterlude and especially If Dogs Run Free. I love If Dogs Run Free now. I think it's an absolutely hilarious song. I think it's clearly meant to be this like satire of beat poetry, and I think it succeeds in that realm. And it's a satire that I think is both loving and also kind of cutting too. It's that kind of dichotomy, that balance that I think Dylan strikes in so many things. So yeah, I think New Morning is, if not the most ambitious thing he ever released by any means, I think it is one of his more solidly enjoyable albums from start to finish. I'm always happy to put it on, always happy to give it a spin. And yeah, really good. Number 16. Number 15, I have 1983's Infidels. This is a really good record, and were it not for one other one, it would be very easily his best record of the 80s. But again, kind of like Desire, we have a record that I think is built in halves. I think half of this record is spectacular, and half of this record is fine. The fine half, I think the worst it gets is Neighborhood Bully, which I don't think fundamentally is an awful song, but like Joey, I think its lyrics drag it down, certainly, for reasons that are not worth getting into at this point in time. We'll put it that way. But at least with Neighborhood Bully, unlike Joey, it is mercifully on the shorter side and not 11 minutes long. But yeah, I am partial to the kind of general 80s sound on this record. Like I said, I don't think this is as far removed from Empire Burlesque sonically as people think it is, but I do think it is used a lot more tastefully here, a lot more gently, and when it works, it really works. I really like I Don't Fall Apart on Me Tonight, I think is great. Sweetheart Like You is terrific, but the clear highlight is Joker Man. What can you say about Joker Man? It's one of the best sets of lyrics he ever put to record. It's I think definitely his best song of the 80s and one of his best post 70s songs ever. It's a record that, in a way, kind of like Hurricane on Desire, it kind of sets you up for failure because you get the high point at the beginning and it just never gets there afterwards. But man, Joker Man is, I think, also very refreshing too. And maybe that's part of what makes me put Infidels higher than Desire is Joker Man coming in after you just had the trilogy of like Christian Records and Street Legal and all that. Such a breath of fresh air from a songwriting standpoint. So well done. That said, everyone talks about the outtakes from Infidels. I've not listened to anywhere near all the outtakes from Infidels and all the unreleased songs, but I did listen to the original like bootleg series and stuff like that. Blind Willie McTell is one of Bob Dylan's best songs. Like, not including that on this record is one of the all-time bag fumbles ever. Holy shit. I digress. Check out Blind Willie McTell if you haven't. And check out Infidels. Really great record, I think. Really solidly underrated by a lot of people. And if it is a bit patchy, I think I'm willing to look past those patches more so than I am Desire. Number 14, I have 1964's Another Side of Bob Dylan. In the past, historically, I kind of had this one in Times They Are a Changin' more or less switched around. I used to not like this record as much as I did Times. What changed about that? I don't really know, just time, and I think I've learned to appreciate the more subtle appeal of this record compared to Times' kind of more brazen and obvious protest lyrics. Another side is Dylan kind of really stepping into songs about himself, songs about love, and setting the stage for lyrical ideas that he will then explore with more psychedelic influence on the kind of Electric trilogy in the mid-60s. And what a set of songs they are. I mean, the Byrds' entire career is basically found in this record, more or less. All I Really Want to Do, Spanish Harlem Incident, Chimes of Freedom, My Back Pages, It Ain't Me, Babe. I mean, so many strong tracks. To Ramona. I think this record is also to me, I think it's a very clear jumping off point for something like Bringing It All Back Home. I don't mean to diminish Bringing It All Back Home and its freshness in the sense of, hey, here's the electric sound that absolutely blows everything else he's done out of the water. But more so if you listen to especially the second side of Bringing It All Back Home, it's a step removed from another side of Bob Dylan, if that. It's that type of writing. And I think Dylan, especially Dylan performing this album like entirely solo and recording it all in a single day, speaks to the level that he was working on as a performer and as a writer at that point. And I think that context in particular helps you really appreciate just kind of what an achievement Another Side is. So it's kind of a step removed from being truly, truly top shelf Dylan. Again, we're splitting hairs here, but it's phenomenal. It's a great album. Highly recommend checking it out. Number 13, I have 1967's John Wesley Harding. This is, as I said kind of at the outset, this is a beguiling record. This is one of the most lyrically dense Dylan records ever, if not the most. And there is a confusion in that, certainly, but there's a lot of appeal too. If you're someone who is looking to study Dylan the poet and study Dylan as someone who is kind of mixing metaphors and covering his overall kind of the message of a song in allegories and stories about fictional characters and stuff like that, John Wesley Harding has the most meat on any of those bones, as it were. There's so much to dig into. I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine, The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, I Pity the Poor Immigrant. So much of that stuff is like, there are meanings and there's symbolism that I think is actually very easy to pick up on with just kind of a superficial reading of the lyrics. But there are other ones that require both like knowledge of the context of the times, but also knowledge about certain like literature, certain literary references that he's making that I think is fascinating. Of course, you also have stuff like All Along the Watchtower on here, which is a terrific song. I think Dylan's version is just as effective as Hendrix's version in its own way. I'll Be Your Baby Tonight is also terrific. It's just, there's a lot to chew on here, and it's not as immediately enjoyable, I think, as much of what Dylan had recorded beforehand, but it's a record that rewards repeated listenings, and certainly that's been the case for me when I've heard it. So, if you've found this one a difficult nut to crack, I validate that experience, because that's certainly been the case for a lot of people. But it's worth revisiting and worth checking out. Just make sure for this one, especially if you're going to read any Dylan record if you're going to listen to any Dylan record with the genius lyrics in front of you or something like that, make sure it's this one. At number 12, we have a candidate for possibly the most underrated Bob Dylan record for me personally, and that is 1974's Planet Waves. A record that I think is commonly considered by Dylan fans to be good. It's a good album. It is a good Bob Dylan album, and that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. I propose as a counter argument that Planet Waves is a great Bob Dylan record, a really great Bob Dylan record, in fact. And I actually think that this album is not nearly as far removed from Blood on the Tracks as people think it is. Certainly there are differences, right? This is the only proper studio album he did with the band. I think immediately you notice the difference in the ensemble. And I think the ensemble really lifts Dylan up. But it's also not just in the instrumental playing. I think Dylan as a vocalist here is at maybe his peak. I would argue that Planet Waves is the best and most interesting that Dylan has ever sounded as a vocalist. Tracks like Going, Going, Gone, like Forever Young, of course. Songs like that, songs where Dylan is just sinking into these tracks and singing his ass off in the way that he would later do in like the Before the Flood tour and stuff like that. And you don't see that side of Dylan vocally very much, the kind of almost belter, but you really get it out of him here. And I think that speaks to his connection with these songs. I would agree with the general sentiment that the pure songwriting on this record doesn't necessarily hold up to his absolute best material, including Blood on the Tracks. But I think there is an emotional connection here, and an emotional through line, and a performing through line that connects this record very closely with Blood on the Tracks. When I think about some of the best moments of Blood on the Tracks where Dylan, like Tangled Up in Blue, the, standing on the side of the road, like where his voice kind of goes up like that very intentional vocal delivery, that is Planet Waves stuff. Like he's doing that type of thing in Planet Waves. And yeah, it's kind of an oddball in the catalog because of the band's involvement, because it was the only record he released on Asylum and then it didn't sell well afterwards, so he went back to Columbia. But I think the oddball nature of it has caused it to become more underrated than it deserves to be. So if it's not quite a top 10 record for me of Bob's, I think it's one that deserves a lot of reappraisal from a lot of people. Number 11, I have my t-shirt, 2012's Tempest. Tempest is a record that is also, I think, a difficult nut to crack for people. I've heard people say that in particular it's because of how Bob's voice sounds on it. It is certainly the most ragged, like, rah, where he's like growling, that type of thing. He does a lot of that on that album. And I'm not going to pretend that it isn't sometimes a bit much. But it fits the music perfectly, I think. Whereas his voice on this record wouldn't fit, say, a Christmas album perfectly. This is very dark, very grisly material that Dylan is writing about. There's some beauty in it. I think there's some really kind of reflective and powerful tracks on here, like Long and Wasted Years, I think is phenomenal. But stuff like Pay in Blood, like Early Roman Kings, like the title track, which is about the fucking Titanic of all things. I mean, it's about, we're talking about human life. We're talking about death. We're talking about these grisly subjects that are all framed in the performance of this man who is very audibly aging and arguably crumbling himself, even though, of course, it's 12 years past the release date and he's still with us, thankfully. It all works so effectively, and the playing on the album, I think, is terrific as well. It's an album that grew on me very quickly, and I think has continued to grow on me, especially as I've learned to appreciate it more in the context of the tour that he's doing now, where he's playing some of these songs. And I think Tempest, we talk about the trilogy, quote unquote, of Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft, and Modern Times as like his comeback trilogy in his late career years. For one thing, I don't necessarily treat that as a trilogy because I think Time Out of Mind is very much its own thing. But also, I think Tempest stands up to both of those albums easily. I think it is extremely well written. Some of his best lyrics in a hot minute are on this piece. And yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm running out of superlatives for these records, but I think Tempest is extremely well done. And again, another one where if the voice has been, like if his voice has been a barrier, I don't know what to say to make it not be a barrier for you, but I do think there's a lot here that is worth revisiting and taking the time to kind of work on appreciating this record. So Tempest, number 11. Number 10, I have 2001's Love and Theft, speaking of his late career records. Love and Theft is, like I say, I think this is a very different album from Time Out of Mind in style, in substance, in sound. Where I don't think it differentiates from Time Out of Mind is in freshness and in ambition. This is ambitious not because Dylan is treading absolutely uncharted ground in any sense, but I think it's ambitious in how Dylan is so deeply diving into his heritage here. This is really, I think this record in many ways is a continuation of what he's kind of trying to do on stuff like Good As I've Been to You and World Gone Wrong, where he is exploring his roots, American folk music's roots and blues music's roots, and taking that and kind of letting it stew for a while, mixing it together in this concoction, and then coming out with this collection of tracks that are very much him. They are very much Bob lyrics, but are also kind of paying tribute to the style. Stuff like Mississippi, stuff like By and By, High Water for Charlie Patton, possibly my favorite song on here, possibly my favorite Dylan song of the 2000s. So much just really engaging material. And I think the band playing on this record is fire. I think that they lift up, it's hard because I don't also want to say that stuff like Good As I've Been to You and World Gone Wrong are hurt by Dylan performing by himself. Because again, I think that's part of the unique appeal of those records. And also I think part of it too is that, again, they're covers albums. But I think the mixture of the other players on here, the other guitars, and the ensemble sound with Dylan acting as this very kind of firm leader of everything. Again, it's that dynamic that you see in concerts from that period and from this current period that we live in now. I think the ensemble lifts up the material and makes it, it makes it extremely fresh. It makes a record that is inherently a throwback effort extremely fresh, extremely eye-opening. And yeah, there's a lot to dig into here. Like I said, unusually kind of light fare as far as Dylan records go from this era in particular, which I think is also valuable. Would I go so far as to say that this is a happy album from start to finish? Absolutely not. There's definitely some downer moments, pretty huge downer moments, but it's one of the lightest and most enjoyable pieces of his, 21st century material. So in that sense, Love and Theft has a ton of value. I think it's a record that will continue to grow on me more over time, and I hope that the same is true for you. Number 9, I have 1989's Oh Mercy, the first record that he worked on with Daniel Lanois, and by far his best record of the 80s. Daniel Lanois, I must admit, I'm kind of a sucker for his production style. I've enjoyed his work on pretty much every single album he's produced, even the ones where the music I'm not a huge fan of. I think he taps into some sort of like spacious sound that is, again, kind of rooted in organic textures, but also kind of sounds like something, I don't know, not in this realm, I guess. Oh Mercy, I think, is a great example of it, because I think these are very much songs that are rooted in the real world, songs that are rooted in either human emotions or just general observations. But the kind of mixture of production ideas and the instrumentation on here just adds some sort of ethereal component that's hard for me to kind of quantify or qualify in words. But what I do know is that Dylan goes from making the most uninspired material in his career up to this point in his previous 2 records to making really interesting, engaging songs where he's reflecting on himself, he's reflecting on relationships and society, and just it all comes across in such a compelling package. I love Ring Them Bells, Man in the Long Black Coat most of the time. I think that stretch right there is superb. What Was It You Wanted? Shooting Star, the closer. It's another track I got to see him perform live. Yeah, Oh Mercy is definitely the definition of a true comeback album for Dylan. It wasn't a sustained comeback, unfortunately. It does feel like kind of a lightning in the bottle, you know, Lanois inspiring him to go above and beyond type of thing. But in a way that makes what he does with Time Out of Mind and his return to Lanois even more interesting and powerful, because he will continue that momentum into his future records. So, Oh Mercy is my number 9. It's another album that I think will continue to grow on me. And yeah, I mean, we're basically getting into records that are, if they're not flawless, they are close to it at this point. So, yeah. Number 8, I have 1969's Nashville Skyline. Bob Dylan pivots into the world of country music here, and, you know, I don't necessarily know if there was a way this could have ended badly, per se. Dylan definitely is a huge respecter of country music, major fan of it, and it's close enough to what he was doing on John Wesley Harding already to where this probably would have worked unless he had done a self-portrait and intentionally tried to sabotage it. But I don't know if people would have predicted how well it turned out. I love this record. I have a huge soft spot for this album. And so much of it is in, you know, how completely straight Dylan plays the material. And in doing that, also changing his identity by changing his vocal approach completely to something that is very, again, not rich per se. There's not a lot of volume in what he is doing, but he makes it more sensitive, I suppose. It's not as nasal as it normally is, and it fits the material to a T. I think one of the weakest, I mean, maybe the weakest moment on the record is the opening track, frankly, the Johnny Cash duet, just because I think, I've heard some of the other Cash duets, and I think they don't necessarily fit with each other super, super well. But so much of the other material, like To Be Alone With You, I Threw It All Away, Lay Lady Lay, Tell Me That It Isn't True, Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You. I think so much of this stuff is, you know, such a solid mixture of like the playing of, you know, these Nashville session musicians that are working on the record, and Dylan writing material that so sensitively works with that musicianship. This is not Dylan trying to force his 1967 tracks into this aesthetic. This is Dylan trying to write effective country songs that are true to himself, true to his own emotions and experiences, but work in the style. And Lay Lady Lay in particular, I think is absolutely a highlight of his career. I think it's a lovely song, and I think the whole record is a lovely album. It's very romantic. It's, beautiful. It's fun. It's, I think, emblematic almost of the life that Dylan wished he had, that kind of domestic bliss life. And it represents the life that I almost wish he had, that he had been able to have kind of a happier existence. And maybe there's a melancholy in me kind of saying that, but I think there's beauty in it too. And, this alternative future where Dylan is, kind of a recluse, releasing occasional country records and that sort of thing. That means we're not getting a lot of some of the best material he ever wrote, as well as a lot of the worst material he ever wrote. It's true, we're not getting that, but it's an interesting alternative reality to think about, and one that I feel like I would enjoy a lot personally. So, Nashville Skyline, number 8, love it. Number 7, I have 1963's The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Record number 2, and the record that exploded him into stardom. It's not an absolutely flawless album, in my opinion, but boy, it flirts with it. It flirts with it. I think there's so many of his most famous songs come from Freewheelin', and it's one of those things where people always comment on this, and this is not original thought here. But the leap in what he was able to do as a songwriter from 61, 62, when he's writing his first stuff, to 62, 63, when he's recording Freewheelin', it's kind of unreal. And whoever you want to attribute that to, if that's just Bob taking initiative, whether that's Susie Rotolo, his girlfriend at the time, being a huge inspiration for him, certainly that's a part of it. It's still kind of one of the most amazing leaps from, beginning stage of a career to second stage of a career, from record 1 to record 2 that you'll ever see. Blowin' in the Wind, Girl from the North Country, Masters of War, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Don't Think Twice, I Shall Be Free. Almost nothing needs to be said about these albums, because these are about these songs, because these are tracks that could probably have whole books be written about them. And I've had a lot of discourse around them. Corinna Corinna is one that I kind of champion as being an underrated track on the record, simply because it's the one cover on the record. I think people are inclined to downplay cover versions of songs. I think it's phenomenal, one of his best vocals, one of his most passionate performances on the whole album. And yeah, I think there's an interesting mixture of, there's a lot of power in these songs, like Blowin' in the Wind, Masters of War, and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. But you also have tracks like, Bob Dylan's Dream or whatever. Songs that are, show off kind of the more eclectic and interesting sides of Bob Dylan, and show off the humor. I think that doesn't necessarily come through in a lot of his records. That Dylan can be, and still is very funny. And yeah, that freshness on Freewheelin', I think, is just something that, you don't see as much of, even in the very next records, that freshness of this 21-year-old kid who was just kind of burst onto the scene and is finding his sound still, and finding out what he wants to be. And, there's a lot of value to it. So in any case, Freewheelin' is not necessarily the record that, it's a 60-plus-year-old record at this time. It's very rooted in that sound. And a lot of people don't necessarily consider it absolute top shelf Dylan. But for me, it's right up there. It's a phenomenal, enjoyable record. I still get a ton out of it to this day. Number 6, I have 1997's Time Out of Mind. Time Out of Mind is like I said, the second work with Daniel Lanois. And, one of those records that, again, at this point, several Dylan records that have been called a comeback or what have you. But in this case, it's really true. This is Dylan kind of emerging on top after over 20 years of, gradually decreasing commercial and critical relevance. And for this record to come out and not just be a commercial success, but be a huge critical success, winning Grammy Awards and all that sort of thing, it's a huge testament to what the quality of the material that's on here. And make no mistake, this is not by any means a like Steely Dan Grammy Awards situation where this legacy artist wins an award with a record that, by all accounts, is not really all that good. Time Out of Mind is terrific. It's phenomenal. And maybe some people think that its importance has been overstated because of where it falls in the Dylan catalog and it being kind of that first great record after years of irrelevance, but I don't think so at all. I think that Dylan's reflection on mortality here, which he reflects on in quite a few songs, is so interesting, especially given the coincidental, apparently, timing of the health scare that he had around, shortly before this record was released. This is a man who, whether it was because of commercial irrelevance or whether it was because of drug abuse or alcoholism or whatever, this is a man who has kind of seen the end and feels like the end is near. And you hear people who were like following Dylan at that time who thought that he was going to be dead in just a few years because of how far everything had fallen off for him. And so that makes those songs like, I don't know, Standing in the Doorway, Trying to Get to Heaven, Not Dark Yet, Cold Irons Bound. It makes these tracks really powerful. And that closing track, Highlands. A lot of people think that kind of criticize Highlands for being overly long, 16 and a half minutes long or whatever, and I don't feel that at all. I think it's the fastest 16-minute song I've ever heard in my life. The mixture of what Dylan is talking about with the pitch perfect decisions from Lanois from a production standpoint, whether it's, really focusing on kind of the groove of some of these tracks or whether it's focusing on the haunting darkness of some of these tracks, I think almost every decision made is clearly the right one. And it's kind of a gobsmacking record. It floors you when you first hear it. And I think it floors you even more in the context of a discography dive like this. After, again, getting through all the records, all the shit that came before it, and even after getting through Oh Mercy, which is a great album, but it doesn't necessarily leave you taken aback like this one does. Time Out of Mind is phenomenal. It's well worth your time. And it, I think if we're talking about getting to the core of who Bob Dylan is, then there are not too many records that do a better job of it than Time Out of Mind. Certainly when it comes to figuring out what his headspace is in any given moment. Check it out. All right, number 5, I have 2020's Rough and Rowdy Ways. Rough and Rowdy Ways is an album that has grown immensely on me. I think if I did this list before, kind of revisiting this catalog over the last few months, this would be in like the teens somewhere. It was a record I really liked when it came out, but I didn't necessarily rate it on the level of some of his other 2000s stuff and things like that. But now, having heard it again and again, especially after hearing it in the context of everything that came before it, it floored me again. I'm not going to necessarily say that any of the top 4 records, quote unquote, floor me, because as you know by now, the top four that I have are the conventional top four, records that I've heard many times over the years, records that I'm familiar with to the point where they can't really floor me anymore as much as some of these fresher discoveries can. But Rough and Rowdy Ways feels, again, I use the word culmination. It feels like Dylan's career was meant, and all of these different things and events that happened to Dylan were all meant for the purpose of producing Rough and Rowdy Ways, because this record summarizes everything. I personally would say that this is Dylan's best lyrical record ever. I think that, age does not necessarily define lyrical ingenuity, but it does in many ways shape lyrical perspective. And, Dylan's starting out this record with a statement like, I contain multitudes, about himself, and then kind of gearing it towards all these other reflections on himself, on his legacy, that are not necessarily always obviously talking about himself, but clearly are references to him, like False Prophet, I think, is a good example of that. Black Rider, again, talking about death. There's the Time Out of Mind connection right there. Again, you have kind of the Love and Theft, like blues and folk rock country inspirations that are all around here, but again, it's darker and has that kind of Tempest tinge to it, that makes everything tinted in a very kind of heavy sort of sense. And then I think some of the like instrumental choices and things like that are connected very directly to the Standards records, as far as how kind of, sparse they are, and how Dylan's leaving a lot of space in the arrangements in a way that maybe you don't hear as much in some of his earlier records. And then, you get through everything. There's so much great stuff. Goodbye Jimmy Reed, Crossing the Rubicon, Key West. But then you get to Murder Most Foul. And Murder Most Foul is a song that, admittedly, like when I heard about it at first, this is before I heard the song, I almost kind of laughed, because it was Dylan writing a song about the JFK assassination. It seemed like the most 60s thing ever, and the most kind of boomer thing ever. And in a way, you almost have to wonder, like, what could anybody, even someone like Bob Dylan with his credentials, what could he possibly add to talking about one of the most important events in the 20th century? But the way that Dylan frames Murder Most Foul is the success, because he's not just talking about Kennedy. He's not just talking about the assassination. He is talking about what the assassination represented for the country, what it represented for himself, and what kind of how all those events and all that trauma resulted in people kind of going to music and to art in general as a coping mechanism. And Dylan, I think, in doing that, is recognizing that while he's naming off all these other songs and all these other artists that he's talking about here, he's also talking about himself, because in many ways he represents that. He's like, I understand that I owe my success to a grieving public in some way. You connect that with the times they are a-changin', of course. I mean, I think all those songs were recorded before JFK's assassination, but being released after the fact lends them a lot more power. And so that kind of, that kind of summary of his legacy, I think, is just gobsmacking. It's one of his greatest achievements, period, as a songwriter and as an artist. And it ends off this admittedly rather long record on just a remarkable note. So Rough and Rowdy Ways is fantastic. I think, the cliche is like, which Dylan record is the best since Blood on the Tracks? Like, every time a Dylan album gets released, everyone says, oh, it's his best Blood on the Tracks or whatever. And this is it to me, out of everything that has come out since then. This is his best since Blood on the Tracks. It floors me. I enjoy it. I meditate on it and reflect on it. And it moves me. And it's terrific. And I'm saying it's number 5 right now, but even after talking about it and raving about it as much as I have, I could absolutely see it going higher on my list. So, Rough and Rowdy Ways. Wow. Listen to it. Okay, I don't think the top 4 records need a whole lot of justification about why they're here, so I might not have as much to add about them. But of course, I'm going to talk about them because I have to, and because they're all terrific records. What do you want me to say? Number 4, 1966's Blonde on Blonde. Double record. I mean, pretty, like, genuinely a daring idea at that point in time. And, this is very much, I think, the apex of Dylan as, like, the cultural and musical leader of that time. This was the last record made before his motorcycle crash. He is, clearly at the peak of his popularity and of just his controversy as well. And this is also the style of Dylan writing and singing that is the most kind of mimicked. When you think of people imitating Dylan and that sort of thing, it's this era of Dylan that they're usually trying to parrot. But you can't argue with the material. That's the thing. It is a record. It is one of the strongest front to back double albums probably ever made. And I don't think there's anything close to a mediocre or weak song on it. I think part of why, so again, if we're splitting hairs and we're saying why these 4 fundamentally flawless records, why one is lower than the other, I think my splitting hairs is, again, the length in part. Also, I don't know about the sequencing. I'm not convinced by the sequencing. The biggest example, I think, is definitely Rainy Day Women being the opener. I think it's just really out of place as an opener. I don't think it's anywhere close to being a weak song. But I do think that if you're thinking from a sequencing standpoint, it starts on that initial track and it kind of starts unsteady and like almost a joke, and you're kind of left wondering what the rest of the record is going to be like. And then Pledging My Time comes in, and then fucking Visions of Johanna comes in, and you're like, all right, we're fine, we're in the clear. But yeah, a bunch of terrific songs. I called out Visions of Johanna. That one is a contender for my favorite Bob Dylan song. I adore it. Powerful track, love it to death. But I Want You, Stuck Inside a Mobile, Just Like a Woman, Temporary Like Achilles, Fourth Time Around, and Sad Eyed Lady. I mean, again, all songs that are in the Dylan Hall of Fame, as it were, and for very good reasons. I think the backing ensemble here, of course, including, Robbie Robertson and Rick Danko, are really terrific. I think Robertson especially adds a lot to the sound of this one with his guitar playing. Yeah, I mean, it's Dylan, the cultural monolith, kind of emblemized in album form. And what can be said about it other than that? Blonde on Blonde is, it's quote unquote only my number 4, but fundamentally flawless record, as all of these other top 3 ones are. Number 3, I have 1975's Blood on the Tracks. Blood on the Tracks is, again, the comeback record from the mid-70s that drew everyone's attention. And clearly there's a reason for it. It's the most maybe lyrically inspired thing that Dylan had done in years, and maybe ever to that point, honestly. And it's one of the most personal and revealing sets of lyrics that he ever put out. And, I don't necessarily think cutting open a vein is always a successful way of songwriting. Because I think you have to be able to execute like other like fundamentals too. Like, I'll use an example, and people are going to get pissed that I use this example, but when I think of Taylor Swift, right? Taylor Swift is someone who her appeal is kind of expressing her emotions, expressing her lived experiences in songs and being vulnerable in that way. And that's why a lot of people connect with her. That's not why she's making it number one on the charts, though. She's making it number one on the charts because she's fundamentally one of the best pop songwriters of the last 20 years. And she knows how to craft effective songs that have a lot of mass appeal, and have a lot of merit in that sense. And Dylan is clearly operating on the same level here. Now, he's not intending this for radio play per se, but Dylan is taking these, these kind of journal entries, these word vomits of lyrical ideas that he was doing around this time, and he's transformed them into these fascinating songs with these unbelievable melodies. The melodies on tracks like Tangled Up in Blue, Simple Twist of Fate, Idiot Wind, Shelter from the Storm, are some of the best of his career. Pairing that with his emotive singing, we talked about Planet Waves and how I think the singing on there is as good as he ever did. I think Blood on the Tracks is only a step removed from that. Man, it's also good. It's also effective, powerful. I have to give extra points to Blood on the Tracks for being the only record I think that he recorded in Minneapolis or partially recorded. I know people have their opinions about, do they prefer the earlier New York City sessions or do they prefer the later Minneapolis sessions? Your mileage may vary. I'm proud of my local boy. What can I say? But, yeah, every bit of praise that you hear thrown at Blood on the Tracks for being emotionally powerful and cutting and some of the best lyrics that Dylan ever wrote. All that is true. I don't need to say much more about it. If you probably already checked it out, but if you haven't, make it a priority. It's easily one of his best records. Okay, I had to think a bit about what I wanted number one and number two to be. Because I think it was always, because these four records interchange to some degree. But I knew it was going to be between these two for my top two. And so number two, I'm going to go with 1965's Highway 61 Revisited. And I'll talk about the reasoning for why I went with the other one at number one when we get there. But Highway 61 has one of the most impeccable track lists of any rock album ever released. There's nothing to be said about it. It is consistently one of the most acclaimed rock records of all time because of how it mixes that sort of rock instrumental ethos with a genuinely really strong ensemble. I think the one thing that this record does have over the record that came before it is I think the ensemble is clearly stronger here. And the songs are just masterclasses in lyricism, in mixing, again, kind of like mixing metaphors and stuff like that. This is actually another record I think is very dense in the John Wesley Harding-like way. But I think part of why people struggle more with John Wesley Harding is because they haven't invested the time into that record that people have with Highway 61. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Highway 61 is probably the most lyrically talked about record ever made. And even getting aside from that, because admittedly my knowledge of the lyrical analyses of these songs is not super thorough, so I'm not going to be someone who's going to be breaking down line by line what each of these songs mean without having a lyric sheet in front of me anyways. But what I can talk about is Like a Rolling Stone as an opener. I think it is attention gathering. I think it is so, again, the lyrics on their own, if he had just written it as an acoustic song, would have been extremely effective. Again, you think of the Another Side of Bob Dylan sound and what he was doing there. I think Like a Rolling Stone would have that same effect. But adding the organ, adding the guitars, adding the piano and all the extra instrumentation that is on that track, that's why it succeeds. It succeeds because it's great ensemble playing. And you get that throughout everything else, whether it's Takes a Lot to Laugh, whether it's Ballad of a Thin Man, Queen Jane Approximately, Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, Desolation Row, which might be my favorite song on the album. It just, start to finish, it is interesting, incredibly unique lyrics for the era from a popular songwriter, matched with ensemble playing that, again, I don't know if I would call it up to the standards of the best rock bands of the era, but still fundamentally extremely like strong. They have a very tight understanding of dynamics. I mean, they're all recording this stuff live in the studio and everything. So that kind of playing around, that experimentation, that band dynamic is what lifts Highway 61 to a new level as a record compared to what rock music was capable of doing before. You've probably already listened to it. And if you haven't, I mean, I don't know what to say. Highway 61 Revisited. It's revered for a reason. Check it out. And of course, that means at number 1, I have 1965's Bringing It All Back Home. Now, probably not a ton of people who put Bringing It All Back Home ahead of Highway 61 Revisited. There's certainly, we have our camp, but it's certainly not a majority by any means. And the reason why I do it is because this is consistently for me the Bob Dylan record that I go back to the most, just because I think it's such an engaging album from start to finish and has some of the best sense of momentum, sense of flow that I've ever heard in an album, period. And that's not to take away from Highway 61 or Blood on the Tracks or Blonde on Blonde or anything like that. They're clearly well-crafted records, clearly excellent on innumerable levels. But Bringing It All Back Home, you start off with Subterranean Homesick Blues. I mean, what hell of a way to start. Hell of a way to start any album, especially with the context of Dylan's never come close to approaching this type of sound before. Here's something that's fresh. Here's something that's new. Here's something that's contemporary. And here's something that's cool. And it knocks your socks off. And combined with Dylan's like lyrical approach, which is also different from anything that he's doing before, where he's just, again, rapping, as it were, like spitting out these lyrics, Spitfire, like, it's just, it's something to listen to. It's fucking remarkable. And you have that kind of back and forth between these more kind of sedate tracks with these faster paced ones. You have your She Belongs to Me's, your Love Minus Zeros, coupled with your Maggie's Farms and your Outlaw Blueses on side 1. And then side 2 is where you have like the acoustic stuff, your Mr. Tambourine Man's It's All Right Ma, Gates of Eden, It's All Over Now. All songs that, again, as I was talking about earlier with Another Side, very much in the milieu of Another Side of Bob Dylan, as far as the themes and kind of how he's writing these songs. Again, with a bit more of maybe a psychedelic tinge here. Mr. Tambourine Man especially is just a song that I was familiar with for a long time because of like the Byrds or whoever, but never a song that I'd paid a ton of attention to lyrically until when I really started getting into this record. And then I realized like how much of kind of how much of a bizarro world that whole song is and how brilliant it is. This is one of those things where my justification is I enjoy it more than Highway 61 Revisited. I'm not going to argue the point of that Highway 61 has arguably better songs. If someone wanted to make that argument, I would have no problem taking that or hearing that. But holy cow, if Bringing It All Back Home is not just the one that just speaks to me. It just kind of fills that little spot in my soul. And it's the one, I think this is also the record that has been my anchor point for my Bob Dylan fandom, even back when I would not have considered myself anything close to a huge fan. I think this has always been the exception. This has always been that anchor point of like, well, you know, I like Bob Dylan. I really like him, but I love Bringing It All Back Home. And that's been the standard. That's been how I felt for ages. And I have to give it its respect. Also, this record recorded in like basically 2 days is, again, another just kind of wild thing to think about. I know that type of thing was not super uncommon in those days in general, but still, you think about the creativity and the fact that these songs were written probably in just a matter of weeks or months. You know, the speed and the production of so many artists and musicians around this time, and the quality that some of them were able to still maintain is ridiculous. So, Bringing It All Back Home. It's my number one. You know what to do. Check it out. All right, we finally made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope this was enjoyable. I don't pretend to offer any sort of new insight to any of these records or anything, because there are plenty of people who are way more diehard Bob Dylan fans than I am even now. And I even own a t-shirt now, so that's saying a lot, right? But I hope that it was entertaining to hear someone kind of wax something about Bob Dylan for 2 hours or however long this video is going to be. And I'd be really curious to know what your favorite Bob Dylan records are. If you have a full list, if you have a top 10, top 5, if you have one song that you like and you're looking to get into more, let me know in the comments section below. Please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More reviews, more discography rankings perhaps will be coming kind of, you know, at their own pace over time. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications so you get notifications for any new videos. And then make sure to tell a friend as well. Word of mouth is the best and most effective possible way to share information about any sort of creative endeavors. So if you have anyone who's a Bob Dylan fan, Bob Dylan hater, Bob Dylan neutral, have them watch this video. See if maybe we can convert them to another side, whatever that other side might in fact be. Thanks so much for watching. And without anything else, I'm going to get out of here. I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.